will turn to the ages of globalization and the ways that humanity has interacted across time and space throughout the history of our species. And we will see that history is not only fascinating and fun to understand, and it is. It's just amazing stories. You can't even believe what happened. And the more one knows, the more fascinating history becomes. But history also helps us to understand our interconnectedness and the ways that we can approach problems and find solutions. Let me give you 3 quick examples that we will consider within our course. How history can help us to inform current day solutions. The first is the history of the Silk Roads, the linkages of trade that go back essentially 2,000 years that linked Europe and East Asia. Because even 2,000 years ago, at a time when in Europe there was the Roman Empire, and in East Asia there was the Han Dynasty of China. These 2 great empires, divided by thousands of kilometers distance across the Eurasian landmass, were trading with each other. The patrician ladies of Rome loved the silks that they could obtain from China, and thereby came the name the Silk Roads, which carried precious commodities to and from Europe to China and back. And it was that long-distance trade which helped to promote the prosperity and the sharing of knowledge across that great Eurasian landmass. Well, the Silk Roads teach us something till today. And China today, in our time, has launched the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which we will study in this class, modeled on the Silk Roads. The Chinese government has said that the Silk Roads united the ancient world, and the modern Silk Roads should unite the world today. And so China has initiated a wonderful program called the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to help build the modern linkages, fast rail, fiber interconnectivity, 5G, the long-distance transmission of solar power and other renewable energy to connect the world in a way that the Silk Roads did even 2,000 years ago. Another example of history helping to inform current problems is a darker kind of history, and that is the history of conflict. Well, human history is filled with the history of wars, and sometimes it seems that this is essentially what human history has been, though that is not quite true. But one of the most fascinating and provocative and perhaps informative histories of war is the war that took place between 2 city-states of Greece between 431 BC and 404 BC, known to us as the Peloponnesian Wars, and known to us because of the great Greek historian Thucydides. Now, that was a war that pitted Sparta versus Athens, and essentially the alliances of city-states around Sparta with the alliance of city-states around Athens in a war that lasted for many decades. In the end, Sparta won the war, but in fact, both Athens and Sparta suffered terribly because of this prolonged war, and one can say that there were no real winners in the war at all, which is so typically the case. But the reason that we learn from the history of the Peloponnesian Wars is that the Peloponnesian Wars give us ideas about the dynamics of geopolitics. And it has been argued by historians and political scientists that the Peloponnesian War was essentially a war between a dominant power, Sparta, and a rising power, Athens, and that it was because of the changing relative power of these two city-states that they came into conflict with each other. Well, the analogy has been made with the changing relative power and economic and military might of nations in our time. Notably, the challenge of finding peaceful cooperation between the two most powerful economies of the world, the United States and China. And so the Peloponnesian Wars, as we'll see, gives us some insights in how we must avoid the fate of Sparta and Athens in the 4th century BCE to find a way to avoid conflict between the major powers in our time. And a third lesson from history that we're going to look at very, very closely, which ushered in the 5th age of globalization, the age of oceanic empires, was the voyages of discovery of Christopher Columbus and the other voyages of exploration of his day. And that period, of course, is one of the most remarkable periods of human history and teaches us a lot about interconnectedness. In fact, it's notable when we look to that age of discovery, so-called, the age in which European navigators learned of the sea route between Europe and Asia and discovered accidentally the existence of the Americas. Of course, they didn't discover the Americas because the Americas were highly populated by indigenous nations, but the Europeans didn't know of the Americas until Christopher Columbus's voyages. The momentous impact of those oceanic voyages tell us a lot about creating interconnectedness across the world. And it's worth recalling the words of one of the greatest thinkers of history, and in fact the founder of modern economics, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a British philosopher and originator of modern economics who lived in Scotland and wrote a magnum opus, a great text, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, which basically, in a way, invented modern economics. It's an absolutely brilliant text that we'll have occasion to refer to in this course. But he wrote in The Wealth of Nations something quite stunning for us to consider. He said that the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope, in other words, the voyages of Columbus and the voyages of Vasco da Gama, which went from Europe to the Indian Ocean and to India, he said, Adam Smith said, are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Wow, what a statement, that the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. We're going to learn from that history. We're going to learn why Adam Smith felt that they were so crucial. And in fact, they did change human history in ways that actually Adam Smith even said, because when we quote him, he said their consequence, when he was writing in 1776, have already been very great. But in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. What he's saying is, writing in 1776, events which took place in 1492 and 1498 were so momentous, even now, centuries later, we can't know their full effect. And now we are more than 2 centuries after Adam Smith wrote those words, and it's true what he said. The effect of those voyages and what we can learn from them continue to be astounding. So we will learn from history. We will learn from the Silk Roads. We will learn from the Peloponnesian Wars. We will learn from the voyages of discovery at the end of the 15th century about our world today. History is fascinating in and of its own right. It's wonderful storytelling, sometimes, often more amazing than fiction, but it's also a way for us to understand how the world interacts and how the world changes. And in our course, we will make use of history to help us to find solutions so that we achieve in our time sustainable development.